Something happened in Japan this week that made even seasoned volcanologists sit up and take notice. Two separate volcanoes, hundreds of miles apart, on two different islands, with two completely different eruption histories, both roared to life within the same stretch of days. One of them is the most active volcano in the entire country, a mountain that erupts so often that locals barely look up anymore. The other had been sitting in near total silence for 22 years, long enough that an entire generation of hikers had never seen it do anything at all. And then, almost together, they both broke loose. In this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened at each of these volcanoes, why Japan sits in one of the most dangerous volcanic neighborhoods on the planet, and I'm going to give you the honest, complete answer to the question everyone's asking. Is this actually as rare as it sounds, or is there something else going on here that nobody's telling you? Let's get into it. First, let's set the stage, because to understand why this moment matters, you need to understand where Japan actually sits on the map of our planet's fault lines. Japan is not just volcanically active, it is one of the most volcanically dense countries on Earth, home to roughly 111 officially recognized active volcanoes strung across 4 main islands. That is not an accident of geology. It is the direct result of Japan sitting at the collision point of 4 tectonic plates: the Pacific, the Philippine Sea, the Eurasian, and the North American plate, all grinding, sinking, and colliding beneath the archipelago. When an oceanic plate dives beneath a continental one in what geologists call a subduction zone, it drags water and sediment down into the Earth's mantle, and that process melts rock and builds the very magma chambers that eventually erupt as volcanoes. Japan sits directly on top of several of these subduction systems at once, which is exactly why the country hosts about a tenth of all the active volcanoes on the entire planet, despite being a relatively small nation. So when we talk about 2 volcanoes acting up around the same time, we are talking about a country where that is, in one sense, simply the background hum of daily geology. But what happened this time was not ordinary background hum, and here's why. Let's start in the north, on the island of Hokkaido, because this is genuinely the more remarkable of the 2 stories. Mount Tokachi, a volcanic complex in central Hokkaido, erupted on July 22nd, sending a black ash plume roughly 200 meters into the air from its 62-2 crater. That might sound modest compared to some of the eruptions you've seen in headlines, but the significance here has nothing to do with size and everything to do with time. This was Tokachi's first eruption since February of 2004. 22 years of silence, broken in a matter of seconds. For context, an entire generation of Japanese hikers has grown up never having seen this mountain do anything more than steam quietly. Japan's meteorological agency had actually been watching Tokachi closely for months beforehand. They detected ground inflation at depth starting back in March, rising sulfur dioxide emissions, and increasing seismic activity around that same crater since April. So this was not a bolt out of the blue, it was a mountain that had been quietly loading up energy for months before it finally let go. The alert level was raised in mid-June, and by late July the mountain made good on the warning. Now let's head south, all the way down to Kyushu, to a completely different volcano with a completely different personality. Sakurajima sits in Kagoshima Bay, and it is, without exaggeration, the single most active volcano in Japan. This is not a mountain that wakes up once every 22 years, this is a mountain that erupts constantly, sometimes multiple times a week, sometimes multiple times in a single day. By late July of this year alone, Sakurajima had already logged its 15th explosive eruption of 2026. In early August, it produced a genuinely powerful blast, sending an ash plume roughly 3,000 meters into the sky, dramatic enough to trigger volcanic lightning that lit up the night over Kagoshima City. Around that same window, the nearby Shinmoedake volcano, part of the Kirishima volcanic complex, was also sitting at an elevated alert status, meaning Japan's monitoring agencies had their eyes on more than one active vent in the same region simultaneously. So here is the honest answer to the question this video's title is asking, and I want to give this to you straight rather than oversell it. Is it unusual for 2 Japanese volcanoes to show significant activity in the same window of days? Genuinely, no, not on its own. With Sakurajima erupting on a near-weekly basis and Japan hosting over 100 active volcanoes, some overlap in timing is close to statistically guaranteed rather than some rare cosmic alignment. Scientists have not recorded some kind of never-before-seen planetary event here, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I told you otherwise. What actually makes this moment stand out, and why it's genuinely worth your attention, is the contrast between these two specific volcanoes. One of them is the most relentlessly active volcano in the country, essentially always simmering. The other had been so quiet for so long that its sudden eruption caught even monitoring scientists' attention, because a 22-year gap is a real geological event on a human timescale, even if it's nothing unusual on a geological one. When a volcano that rarely speaks suddenly does, right around the same time as the country's loudest, most talkative volcano puts on one of its biggest shows of the year, that convergence is a legitimately interesting story, just not for the reason a dramatic headline might suggest. And this actually matters for a very practical reason, because it's a perfect illustration of something volcanologists deal with constantly: the gap between what sounds alarming and what is actually dangerous. Tokachi's eruption, despite ending 22 years of silence, was small. A brief ash plume, about 45 seconds of volcanic tremor, and monitoring cameras did not observe any large ballistic rocks being thrown from the crater. The Japan Meteorological Agency kept the alert at a moderate level, restricting access within about 1.5 kilometers of the crater, but told nearby municipalities that daily life was largely unaffected. Sakurajima's eruption, on the other hand, looked far more dramatic on camera, with its towering ash column and volcanic lightning. But this is simply what Sakurajima looks like on an active week. It is a volcano that has learned to live alongside a major city, and Kagoshima has decades of infrastructure, monitoring, and public habit built around exactly this kind of activity. So the mountain that looked scarier on video was actually the more routine event, and the quieter, smaller eruption up in Hokkaido was the one that actually broke a 22-year pattern. That contrast is the real lesson hiding inside this story. It is tempting to look at dramatic footage and assume that is where the danger lives. But the volcanoes that scientists watch most closely are often not the loudest ones. They are the ones that behave unpredictably or wake up after long stretches of silence. Because those are the volcanoes without a recent track record to compare against. A mountain like Sakurajima has generated so much data over so many decades that scientists can read its moods almost like a familiar language. A mountain like Tokachi, waking up after 22 years, is closer to an unknown quantity, and that uncertainty is exactly why the buildup in ground deformation and gas emissions earlier this year had monitoring teams paying such close attention long before the eruption ever happened. So here's what I actually want you to take away from everything we just walked through, because I think it matters more than the headline that probably got you to click on this video in the first place. Two volcanoes acting up in roughly the same window of days is not some unprecedented planetary alarm bell. It is not a sign that the Earth is somehow destabilizing, and I am not going to pretend otherwise just to keep you watching for another 30 seconds. If you came here expecting me to tell you that scientists are panicking, or that this is some kind of world-first event, I would be lying to you, and honestly, that kind of exaggeration is exactly what makes this entire topic harder for people to trust. Japan sits on top of one of the most geologically restless patches of crust on the entire planet, home to roughly 111 active volcanoes, and Sakurajima alone erupts so often that by the time you finish watching this video, there is a real chance it has already produced another small explosion somewhere on its slopes. When you have that much simmering activity packed into one country, some overlap in timing between different volcanoes is not a freak coincidence. It is closer to a mathematical inevitability. But here is why I still think this moment is worth your attention, and why I spent this entire video walking you through it instead of just shrugging it off as background noise. What actually happened here is a genuinely rare kind of side-by-side comparison. You had Japan's most talkative volcano, a mountain that has essentially become part of the daily rhythm of life in Kagoshima, putting on one of its more dramatic displays of the year, complete with volcanic lightning and a towering ash column visible for miles. And at almost the exact same time, hundreds of miles away on a completely different island, you had a volcano that had said almost nothing for 22 straight years suddenly breaking its silence. That is not two random data points. That is two completely different flavors of volcanic risk playing out in the same country, in the same week, giving scientists, and honestly the rest of us, a rare opportunity to see the full spectrum of what volcanic activity actually looks like in a single snapshot of time. One end of that spectrum is loud, familiar, and thoroughly documented. The other end is quiet, unpredictable, and precisely the kind of event that keeps monitoring agencies up at night, because a volcano without a recent track record is always the harder one to read. And that contrast is really the whole point of this video. It is tempting, especially with a headline like the one that brought you here, to assume the danger lives wherever the footage looks the most dramatic. But that instinct is often backwards. The volcano that looked the scariest on camera was the one behaving exactly the way everyone expected it to behave, following decades of well-documented patterns that Kagoshima's residents and Japan's monitoring agencies have built their entire lives and infrastructure around. Meanwhile, the volcano that produced a comparatively small, almost unremarkable ash plume was the one that actually broke a genuine, decades-long pattern of silence. And that is precisely why scientists had been watching it so closely for months beforehand, tracking ground deformation, rising gas emissions, and shifting seismic activity long before it ever erupted. The real story here is not about which mountain made better television. It is about how differently scientists have to think about a volcano with a rich, predictable history compared to one that just broke a 22-year silence with almost no modern precedent to compare it against. This is also, I think, a useful lesson in how to consume this kind of news going forward, because stories like this one are only going to become more common as more people install earthquake and volcano tracking apps and start paying closer attention to seismic and volcanic activity around the world. The moment you start watching closely, you start noticing things that were always happening in the background, and it becomes very easy to mistake normal geological rhythm for something alarming and unprecedented. Japan lives with this reality constantly. It always has, and it always will, for as long as those tectonic plates keep grinding beneath the archipelago. That is exactly why the country has built some of the most sophisticated volcanic and seismic monitoring networks anywhere on Earth, precisely so that events like this one, dramatic on the surface but thoroughly explainable once you understand what is actually happening underneath, get treated with real scientific attention rather than blind panic. If you found this breakdown useful, drop a comment and tell me which of these two eruptions actually surprised you more: the sudden wake-up after 22 years of silence, or the routine, almost expected power of Japan's most active volcano doing what it does best. I genuinely read every single comment, and it helps me figure out exactly what to dig into next on this channel. If you learned something new watching this, go ahead and tap that like button so more people find the real, grounded version of this story instead of the exaggerated one circulating everywhere else. And if you want to stay ahead of the next development, subscribe and turn on notifications, because Japan's volcanoes are not slowing down anytime soon, and I will be right here tracking every meaningful update as it happens.